The Tigris and the Euphrates. The sources or beginning of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are in the Armenian highlands of eastern Turkey. That would be up here. The Tigris begins at Lake Hazar. There we can see it there. And travels about 1,900 kilometers, 1,181 miles to its mouth or end in the Persian Gulf. So it travels. The Tigris is up here and it's going to go all the way down into the Persian Gulf. Way down here. Or end. The main source of the Euphrates River is on Mount Ararat. So the Euphrates would come from way up here in Mount Ararat and come all the way down, doing the same thing, flowing down into the Persian Gulf. After traveling approximately 2,800 kilometers or 1,740 miles, it too empties into the Persian Gulf. Not so coincidentally, Mount Ararat is the mountain upon which the biblical Noah parked his ark. Given that the Jewish faith began in ancient Mesopotamia around the year 2000 BCE, it's not surprising that the source of such an important river would feature in the biblical myth of Noah. As the Tigris and Euphrates flow through Mesopotamia, they collect salts and loose, mineral-rich soil called silt. Originally, the rivers flowed separately into the Persian Gulf. However, over time, the silt carried downriver was deposited at their separate mouths to form a vast alluvial plain. I'm going to show that in the black map. But this is here where it's going to come together, those two rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers eventually merged into one before flowing into the Persian Gulf at the Shat al-Arab. Farming in the desert. The absence of adequate precipitation to sustain farming was also called a drought, forced ancient Mesopotamians to obtain their water for farming from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Irrigation canals were dug to let water flow from the rivers to the fields. Mesopotamian fields tended to be long and narrow to provide more farmers with direct access to the rivers for irrigation. Livestock were grazed on uncultivated areas beyond the fields where the farmland met the desert. Here's a picture of our irrigation canals, and they haven't actually changed much in 8,000 years. They're still there. Over the centuries, of course, or path of the Tigris and Euphrates has changed, which naturally occurs with rivers. However, when the rivers moved away from existing farmlands, farmers were forced to relocate or dig new irrigation canals. In areas where water levels were lower than the adjoining fields, Mesopotamian farmers developed the shaduf, a weighted bucket mechanism with which Mesopotamians and later Egyptians lifted water from the rivers to pour into the canals. So if you did your irrigation slideshow, you would know a little bit about this contraption, or really interesting innovation they came up with. Mesopotamians also developed the noria, a water wheel which took advantage of the river current to bring river water to irrigation canals. The river current pushed water into a collection of buckets, which forced the wheel to rotate and lift the water-filled buckets to a water trough where they were emptied. Water then flowed to the fields and villages. So you can see the running stream, and the buckets would come through and just collect, and it would move into a trough and then be dumped into the appropriate fields. Here's our noria. Ancient Mesopotamians also developed the cedar plow, which allowed them to plow their fields and plant seeds at the same time. Quite a time saver. So here we have a depiction of the plow tied to some oxen. So instead of digging out those fields, they did it and were able to complete it with a plow. Magic mud. The Tigris and Euphrates brought valuable water through the desert to farms. The silt they brought was equally important. Each spring, the floodwaters deposited nutrient-rich silt along with the water. Minerals and nutrients in the silt nourish plants without the need for additional fertilizer. Flood protection. But this silt was a curse as well as a blessing. Silt collected on the bottoms of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and over time raised up their overall water level to become higher than most surrounding fields. Although water flowed more easily down into irrigation canals, flooding became more devastating. Wooden gates were then installed between the rivers and canals to control the water flow. Irrigation canals were used not just for carrying water to fields, but also to relieve flooding. Floodwaters could be drained from the Tigris and Euphrates and stored in canals away from crops. Silt, which collected in the canals, would be dug out after harvest and added to the fields or molded into mud bricks. Further protection from flooding was provided by earthen levees, which ancient Mesopotamians built along the rivers. Silt deposited on the riverbanks during floods also created natural levees and was an easy source of soil for fields and mud bricks. And here's our levee, which is really just an earthen dam that's been created either naturally or by the Mesopotamians. Here's a picture of fields along the Tigris River with an irrigation canal, a modern picture. So a lot of things have not changed too much. Why the Euphrates? You may have noticed on the Tigris and Euphrates map that more cities are located along the Euphrates River than along the Tigris. So we'll scoot up and take a look. Here's our Tigris. So remember, alphabetically, it starts with E on the lower one, going up to T for Tigris. We've got some cities up here, but as we come down further, not so many on the Tigris. Couple cities up here, but as you get lower, there's quite a few along the Euphrates. Let's find out why. Okay. This is no coincidence, as the Tigris is a faster moving, deeper river which flooded with more devastation than the wider, slower moving Euphrates. Notice how the fields hung the banks of the Euphrates River with the desert immediately behind. So you can see how it really was fertile right along the riverbanks. And then beyond it, we have a very desert like terrain. So this is really key of those ancient river valley civilizations settling there. And that is your reading. Go back to Google Classroom and you can answer the question.